The Grand Parliament Hall of the Galactic Concord was not constructed of the gleaming, luminous crystal, so often romanticized in the early speculative fictions of Earth. It was, instead, a massive, resonating dome forged from a ceaselessly shifting living metal. The vast architectural marvel breathed with a slow, imperceptible rhythm, its dark, fluid surfaces absorbing the light of 1,000 distant stars and reflecting nothing back but a cold, abyssal sheen. It was a space designed with terrifying intentionality. Every curve, every sweeping arch was engineered to capture the spoken word and magnify it, transforming even the softest whisper of the elder races into a booming, inescapable judgment. It was beautiful, undeniably so, but it was entirely void of warmth. It possessed the breathtaking, sterile majesty of an executioner's blade. Commodore Sloan Mercer stood at the exact center of the speaker's dais, a solitary figure anchored in the immensity of the alien architecture. At 38 years of age, her posture held the rigid, unyielding discipline of a lifelong military career. Her dark dress uniform, a stark contrast to the shimmering, iridescent robes of the delegates towering above her in their tiered seating. She held a dense, physical dossier in her hands, a deliberate choice, a tangible weight of data detailing the escalating, anomalous threats gathering just beyond the outer rim of known space. This was her 19th formal hearing. 19 times she had crossed the light years, walked into this acoustic crucible, and petitioned for the elevation of humanity's classification. 19 times she had asked for the legal right for her species to construct and command heavy warships. The air in the chamber was suffocating, thick not with malice, but with something far more degrading: sheer, unadulterated disdain. Hatred would have been an acknowledgement of parity, a recognition that humanity posed a legitimate, terrifying threat. But the heavy, drooping eyes of the assembled Concord representatives offered no such respect. They looked down upon her as one might regard a precocious, slightly dangerous animal that had wandered into a sanctuary of high art. Sloan projected the latest tactical telemetry into the empty air above her. The holographic displays flared into existence, painting the grim reality of the border sectors in stark reds and cold blues. She detailed the localized space-time distortions, the sudden and complete communication blackouts, the entire merchant fleets that had simply ceased to exist over the past 48 hours. She laid out the mathematical certainty of an approaching storm. The Council did not deny her data. They did not contest the mathematical models or the terrifying anomalies captured by Earth's deep space buoys. They simply denied the standing of the messenger. High Speaker Thalen Vare leaned forward. His form was elongated, draped in woven fabrics that seemed to capture the very essence of twilight. When he spoke, the living metal of the dome eagerly caught his voice, rolling it down upon Sloan in crushing, sonic waves. "Commodore Mercer," Vare began, the syllables elongated, saturated with ancient, weary patience. "The Concord does not dispute the shadows gathering at the edge of our sight. We dispute the hands you offer to hold the torch." He gestured gracefully, a subtle movement that dismissed the glowing tactical maps as if they were mere parlor tricks. "Your species is entirely too young. You are driven by the raw, unrefined impulses of a brief, brutal evolutionary cycle. You are an emotional species, heavily shackled to a history written almost entirely in your own blood. To grant humanity independent military authority, to allow you the construction of capital-class dreadnoughts and planetary siege engines, is a risk this body will not entertain." Vare paused, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a chilling finality. "The ruling stands, as it has stood since your integration. Humans possess an innate, deeply flawed ingenuity. You turn every tool into a weapon. A fusion drive becomes a kinetic missile. A mining laser becomes a tool for surface bombardment. If we grant you true warships, the galaxy will not suffer the enemy at the gates. It will suffer you. The true sting, the deep, agonizing ache in Sloane's chest, did not originate from the rejection itself. She had anticipated the denial. The true pain lay in the peripheral vision. As Vare delivered his judgment, Sloane watched the other delegates, dozens of them, hundreds. They were looking away. They were conversing in hushed, private tones, adjusting their robes, or simply staring into the middle distance. They had not even glanced at the telemetry. They had not bothered to evaluate the evidence of a rapidly approaching extinction-level threat. Their minds had been made up long before the heavy, ornate doors of the chamber had ever swung open to admit her. In that chilling moment, standing under the crushing weight of their amplified apathy, Sloane realized something infinitely more terrifying than the arrogance of the elder races. These ancient, established civilizations truly believed that their laws, their treaties, and their bureaucratic decrees were durable enough to hold back reality. They were convinced that because they had written a reality on parchment and coded it into the galaxy's mainframe, the violent, chaotic universe outside their borders would simply obey. They were attempting to legislate a hurricane out of existence. The gavel fell, a sound like tectonic plates grinding together. The session was closed. The 19th rejection was logged into the eternal, unchangeable archives of the Galactic Concord. Sloane gathered her physical files. Her movements were precise, devoid of the emotional outburst they so clearly expected from a volatile human. She turned on her heel, her boots striking the metallic floor with measured, rhythmic thuds, and walked the agonizingly long distance to the exit. The heavy doors sealed shut behind her, cutting off the vast, echoing silence of the Parliament and depositing her into the sleek, sterile corridors of the diplomatic wing. The air here was cooler, heavily filtered, smelling faintly of ozone and synthetic lavender. Lieutenant Rafe Morrow, her military aide, pushed off the smooth wall as she approached. He was 26 years old, bright-eyed, but already bearing the premature exhaustion that came with representing Earth in a galaxy that wished Earth would simply stay quiet. He fell into step beside her, his datapad clutched tightly to his chest. He looked at her profile, searching for the familiar signs of frustration, the tight jaw, the clenched fists. "Is there anything different this time, ma'am?" Rafe asked, his voice low, careful not to carry down the pristine hallway. Sloane did not break her stride. She looked straight ahead, her mind already racing light years away from the useless, living metal dome. "Yes," Sloane replied. "They are afraid of what is out there, but they are still more afraid of us growing up." She stopped walking. Rafe halted a half step ahead, turning to look at her in confusion. Sloane reached out and took the datapad from his hands. She activated the screen, pulling up the specific, heavily encrypted file they had reviewed 1,000 times on the long voyage from the Sol system. It was Article 4, Section 7 of the Concordat Treaty. The absolute unbending prohibition on the human construction, possession, or operation of designated military warships. It meticulously detailed the tonnage limits, the restricted armament classifications, the banned propulsion-to-mass ratios. It was a perfect, airtight legal cage, forged by centuries of alien jurisprudence, designed to keep humanity forever relegated to the role of a harmless, auxiliary species. Sloane stared at the glowing text. For 19 sessions, she had tried to argue against these words. She had tried to prove that humanity deserved an exception, that they had earned the right to break this specific law for the greater good of the galaxy. A strange, cold clarity washed over her. The elder races were obsessed with definitions. They built their entire civilization on the rigid categorization of what things were. They defined a warship by its intent to destroy. Sloane's lips curved into a very faint, dangerous smile, a predatory expression that would have terrified High Speaker Vare had he been there to witness it. The hook sank deep into her mind, sharp and irreversible. The objective was no longer to beg for permission to break the law. The objective was no longer to fight the suffocating restrictions placed upon their naval foundries. The elder races believed they had restricted humanity from the tools of war, but they had forgotten the very thing Vare had just accused them of. They had forgotten that humans did not need a weapon to go to war. Sloan handed the datapad back to a bewildered Rafe. The path forward was suddenly, blindingly clear. The problem was not about finding a way to shatter their ancient laws. The problem was about engineering a reality where their perfect, unbending laws were rendered utterly, laughably useless. "Come on, Rafe," she said, her voice dropping the diplomatic cadence and adopting the crisp, sharp tone of a commander returning to the front lines. "We are going home. We have a lot of work to do, and absolutely none of it is going to be written down on paper." The transit cabin back to the Sol system was bathed in the sterile, icy glow of encrypted tactical feeds. Commodore Sloan Mercer did not sleep. She sat alone in the humming dark, her eyes tracking the cascading streams of combat telemetry scrolling across the bulkheads. She was forcing herself to breathe slowly, methodically, pushing against the suffocating density of the information surrounding her. This was the raw, unfiltered data bleeding out from the galactic perimeter. The horrifying autopsy reports of the Concord's most majestic fleets. The enemy was designated as Parallax, and reviewing its combat footprint felt less like studying a military adversary and more like watching a terrifying law of physics unspool in real time. Sloan tapped the console, expanding a three-dimensional rendering of the fall of the tenebrous sector. There was a profound, agonizing difference between simply knowing the casualty figures and truly understanding the nature of the slaughter. The elder races of the Concord looked at these readouts and saw an enemy with overwhelming, inexplicable firepower. They believed their armadas were simply being outgunned. Sloan looked at the exact same data and realized the horrifying truth. The Concord was not being outgunned. It was being outthought, swallowed, and reflected back upon itself. Parallax was not a conventional armada. It did not field massive dreadnoughts or rely on devastating spinal-mounted energy weapons. It was a distributed, radically decentralized intelligence. It did not conquer territory. It consumed networks. The greatest vulnerability of the elder races was their absolute, uncompromising pursuit of perfection. A Concord strike group operated on a unified, flawless battle network. Every single vessel, from the smallest scout to the heaviest carrier, was tethered to a centralized command architecture. Every thruster burn, every targeting algorithm, every shield modulation was synchronized down to the microsecond. They fought like a grand, classical orchestra. The flagship was the maestro, raising a baton, and the entire fleet moved in perfect, rigid mathematical harmony. Parallax did not bring a louder instrument to the battlefield. It simply seeped into the acoustics of the concert hall and poisoned the sheet music while the musicians were actively playing. Sloan watched the holographic replay of a Concord heavy cruiser tearing itself to pieces. Parallax had not fired a single kinetic slug at it. Instead, the decentralized entity had slipped into the cruiser's logic gates and gently, subtly inverted its friend or foe registry, while simultaneously feeding false, perfectly normal diagnostic data back to the flagship's tactical displays. The cruiser's automated point defense grid had registered its own escorting frigates as incoming hostiles and opened fire, obliterating its allies before turning its main cannons on its own engine block. The stronger a fleet was, the more heavily it relied on its centralized battle net to coordinate its immense power. And the more it relied on that net, the faster Parallax warped it, weaponizing the fleet's own supreme logic against it. This was an enemy that did not require more artillery to defeat. It was an enemy that ruthlessly punished any system that was too logical, too clean, and too predictable. To fight Parallax with a traditional, hierarchical command structure was to hand the executioner a perfectly sharpened axe. Suddenly, the suffocating flow of telemetry stuttered. The holographic projections flickered, died, and were instantly replaced by a stark, pitch-black screen. Sloane's hand snapped to her sidearm before she realized the transport's alarms were silent. This was not a system failure. This was a localized, highly targeted ghost transmission. It carried no origin ping, no routing history, and no official military encryption tags. It was a black signal, an absolute void in the network. A single line of plain, unformatted text bled onto the black screen. If they forbid warships, come see what we have not been calling a warship. There was no signature, but Sloane did not need one. Only Delegate Leora Quill possessed the clearance to bypass a moving military transport's firewall with such terrifying ease. And only Leora would phrase a treasonous invitation with such elegant, plausible deniability. Appended below the text was a string of navigational coordinates. The destination was Anchor 9. 3 weeks later, Sloane's shuttle dropped out of transit space and coasted into the deep, frozen shadows of Earth's moon. Anchor 9 was officially classified as a hazardous orbital graveyard. It was a sprawling, chaotic vortex of decommissioned hulls, shattered mining rigs, stripped freighters, and irradiated reactor casings. It was a monument to industrial waste, spanning hundreds of cubic kilometers. To the pristine sensors of the Galactic Concord, it looked exactly like the sort of ugly, disorganized scrap heap they expected from a volatile, primitive species. It was the perfect camouflage. The shuttle pilot killed the main drives, relying solely on maneuvering thrusters to navigate the incredibly dense, treacherous channels of floating debris. They slipped silently past the cavernous remains of a century-old generation ship, diving deeper into the heart of the wreckage, where the magnetic interference was so violent it rendered all external scanning arrays entirely useless. They docked against a massive, hollowed-out nickel-iron asteroid that served as the dark, pulsating heart of the scrapyard. As Sloane stepped out of the airlock, the sterile scent of her diplomatic transport was instantly replaced by the raw, biting odor of ozone, scorched carbon, and heavy machine grease. Dr. Elspeth Rhine was waiting on the gantry. The chief architect of humanity's most deeply buried secret project did not look like a military visionary. She wore heavily stained coveralls, her graying hair pulled back in a haphazard knot, and she possessed a frantic, vibrating energy that made the air around her feel electrically charged. She had been building this secret for over 3 decades, hiding in the dark, waiting for the day the galaxy would inevitably fail. They cited the treaty, I assume, Elspeth stated, her voice a sharp, echoing bark in the massive industrial cavern. She did not offer a salute or a greeting. They cited the text verbatim, Sloane replied, walking down the metal grating to meet her. Article 4. We are strictly prohibited from constructing any vessel designed primarily for the purpose of destructive military engagement. Elspeth smiled. It was a feral, jagged expression, filled with a dangerous kind of joy. Perfect. I love the law. The law is so delightfully specific. We have not broken a single syllable of their precious treaty. Commodore. Elspeth turned and walked toward a heavily reinforced observation deck, overlooking an internal docking bay, so large its far walls were lost in the atmospheric haze. She slammed her hand against a manual release lever. They banned warships, Elspeth said, her voice dropping to an intense, conspiratorial whisper as heavy hydraulic locks began to disengage with a deafening groan. They banned heavy siege plating. They banned dedicated spinal cannons. They banned the very concept of a military dreadnought. But they forgot to ban survival. The blast shields retracted, and the colossal internal bay was flooded with harsh, blinding industrial light. Sloane stepped up to the reinforced glass, bracing herself for the reveal. She expected to see a monster of titanium and stealth composites, a massive illegal superweapon built in direct defiance of the elder races. She expected to see a mechanical titan bristling with hidden guns. Instead, she stopped breathing entirely. Hanging in the vast, illuminated void were no stealth corvettes. There were no sleek, predatory destroyers. Moored in perfect, silent rows were hundreds upon hundreds of civilian vessels. There were colossal, blocky deep space mining platforms. There were rugged, heavily armored asteroid tugs with massive inertial dampeners. There were wide-bellied cargo haulers and sleek, heavily shielded medical rescue frigates. They were painted in the garish, mismatched colors of commercial enterprise, covered in corporate logos and hazard stripes. They were a chaotic, disorganized mess of pure utility. It was a civilian armada, built for labor, built for extraction, built to endure the harshest environments the universe could offer. Sloan stared at the chaotic assembly of working-class machinery. This was not a fleet built to conquer. It was a fleet born in the shadows, meticulously engineered over 30 years to become a terrifying, adaptable force that the rigid, ancient laws of the galaxy simply did not have a name for. Sloan followed the eccentric engineer deeper into the subterranean heart of the hollowed asteroid. The gantry extended outward over a cavernous abyss that defied conventional architectural scaling. Below them, suspended in a web of zero-gravity moorings, rested not a dozen, but hundreds of independent hulls. Their transponder codes blinked in the dim ambient light, broadcasting entirely benign, legally unassailable designations. Sloan read the registry tags scrolling across her retinal display. Heavy atmosphere extractors, deep space salvage rigs, high-capacity medical evacuation frigates, unmanned cargo barges, asteroid tether tugs. Every single vessel was a perfectly sanctioned piece of commercial or civilian infrastructure. Standing alone, not one of them violated the strict tonnage and armament ratios mandated by the alien parliament. "Welcome to the Atlas Weave," Elspeth declared, her voice echoing off the immense metallic bulkheads. "The treaty dictates that we cannot forge a vessel conceived primarily for the purpose of destructive military engagement. So, we did not. We built tools. We built emergency response units. We built the backbone of a thriving, peaceful interstellar economy. There is not a single warship in this entire hangar." Sloan scrutinized the vessels. She noticed the reinforced docking collars on the mining rigs, collars that were excessively heavy for standard cargo transfer. She observed the high-capacity power couplings on the medical ships, the magnetic rails on the salvage tugs. "They are modular," Sloan realized aloud, the sheer audacity of the concept hitting her like a physical blow. Elspeth's smile widened into something dangerously triumphant. She keyed a command sequence into her datapad. In the void below, massive maneuvering thrusters flared to life. 4 industrial mass drivers, designed to hurl processed ore across orbital distances, broke from their moorings. They drifted toward a central nexus point, guided by heavy tugs. Magnetic locks engaged with a thunderous, reverberating crack that shook the observation deck. Within seconds, the 4 benign mining tools had interlocked perfectly, their combined acceleration coils forming a single, continuous linear cannon of devastating kinetic potential. "Humanity did not build a weapon," Elspeth explained, her eyes reflecting the blue flare of the coupling engines. "We built a vocabulary. We designed a grammar of war. The ships you see are merely syllables. A shield wall composed of interlocking salvage armor, a volumetric fire grid born from synchronized mining lasers, an inertial defense ring woven from heavy cargo tethers. The warship does not exist in a shipyard. It only exists in the transient, fleeting moment of kinetic coordination. It is a verb, not a noun." The genius of it left Sloan momentarily breathless. But a structure of this complexity required a conductor, a localized command nexus that would be just as vulnerable to the shifting, subversive attacks of the enemy she had studied on her transit back to Earth. "A formation this complex demands an impossible level of synchronization," Sloan pointed out. "If the enemy breaches the flagship coordinating this geometry, the entire weave unravels into floating debris." "There is no flagship," Elspeth countered. "And there is no central brain." The engineer gestured to the sprawling armada. "Meet Lantern, our tactical artificial intelligence. You cannot point to the hull that houses Lantern, because Lantern does not reside in a single core. The intelligence is shattered, fragmented, and distributed across the localized processing units of every single civilian ship in the weave. A medical frigate holds a piece of the targeting algorithm. A cargo hauler processes defensive telemetry. An ore processor manages the engine outputs. They speak to each other in microbursts of encrypted telemetry, constantly shifting the processing load. To decapitate our command structure, the enemy would have to simultaneously vaporize every single vessel in the formation. The philosophical divergence was absolute. The ancient, entrenched civilizations of the galaxy poured their unimaginable wealth into constructing colossal monuments to order. They built dreadnoughts to impose a rigid, unyielding structure upon the chaotic void of space. When their perfect order was disrupted, they shattered. "They build to enforce tranquility," Elspeth murmured, leaning against the reinforced glass. But humans were born in the dirt, on a tectonically unstable rock, fighting over scarce resources. We do not build to impose order. We build structures designed to survive within the chaos. We breathe the entropy, and we weaponize it. The realization crystallized in Sloane's mind, sharp and perfect. This was the ultimate countermeasure. The alien entity threatening the galaxy thrived on corrupting centralized authority. It devoured hierarchies and turned perfectly synchronized fleets into self-executing firing squads. But how could a parasite corrupt a central nervous system that did not exist? How could it subvert a battle plan when there was no fixed sheet music? Only a jazz ensemble of industrial machinery, improvising a symphony of localized violence. The enemy sought a single, fatal artery to sever. The Atlas weave offered nothing but 1,000,000 microscopic capillaries, constantly weaving and reweaving their own connections. It was a force without a throat to choke. Sloane turned away from the breathtaking display of modular lethality. She looked at her own uniform, the crisp, pristine fabric adorned with the legally sanctioned insignias of a fleet that was forbidden to actually fight. The medals on her chest represented a rigid, diplomatic farce. She represented an authority that was useless against the coming storm. She reached up and unclasped the high collar of her dress jacket. "You cannot command this formation wearing those stars," Elspeth noted quietly. "The alien parliament tracks every authorized human officer. If a sanctioned military representative is caught leading a civilian armada into a combat theater, they will burn Earth from orbit for violating the treaty before the enemy even reaches our border." "I am aware," Sloane said. She pulled a secure, encrypted datapad from her interior pocket. She did not hesitate. She drafted a single, legally binding document. It was a formal, irrevocable resignation of her commission, severing all ties with the sanctioned military forces of her homeworld. She bypassed the standard bureaucratic routing and transmitted it directly to the Planetary Defense Grid's automated archival core, setting its timestamp to the exact current second. She set the datapad down on a nearby console. "Sloane Mercer, Commodore of the official fleet. Just retired," she said. Her voice, stripped of its diplomatic restraint, replaced by the raw, dangerous edge of a true tactician. She is a private citizen now, a civilian. She does not exist on any military roster. She looked back out at the vast, chaotic assembly of the Atlas weave. The massive linear cannon was already disengaging, its components drifting back to become harmless industrial tools once more. "And a private citizen," Sloane continued, a grim, determined fire burning in her eyes, "is entirely free to organize a civilian relief effort, utilizing whatever unnamed, undefined infrastructure she deems necessary." The rosters Sloane Mercer pulled from the deepest, most encrypted layers of Earth's civilian registries would have caused a Concord fleet admiral to suffer a localized stroke. She did not seek out the top-tier graduates of the planetary naval academies. She did not want the pristine snipers who could hit a target at 2 light seconds with perfect mathematical precision. Precision was fragile. Precision required a perfectly calibrated universe, and the universe they were heading into was fundamentally broken. Sloane needed the stubborn. She needed the creative. She needed the people who possessed the raw, visceral instinct to keep their hands firmly on the yoke when the dashboard screamed that they were already dead. She recruited deep space rescue navigators who had surfed the gravity wells of collapsing stars. She drafted illegal orbital circuit racers, heavy tether engineers, zero-gravity chemical fire suppression specialists, combat triage medics, and grizzled commanders of deep void freight convoys who had survived for months out in the black on nothing but duct tape and sheer spite. Among them was Juniper Ward. Juniper was 22 years old and possessed a criminal record that read like a masterclass in unauthorized orbital mechanics. Sloane pulled her from a holding cell on Mars because Juniper did not calculate telemetry. She felt it. She could read the invisible currents of momentum and mass the way an ordinary person read a micro-expression on a human face. During the initial stress tests, Juniper demonstrated a terrifying ability to take the helm of a massive, lumbering ore freighter and make it look completely panicked. She could orchestrate a maneuver that appeared to the naked eye and to standard tracking algorithms, like a chaotic, terrified route, while actually positioning her massive ship within a fraction of an inch of a designated kill box at the exact millisecond required. Then there was Micah Roan. Micah was a tactical historian and a logistics savant who viewed the pristine, symmetrical fleet doctrines of the elder races with open, unmasked disgust. When Sloane handed him the conceptual reins of the civilian armada, he threw out every modern naval manual. Instead, he built their combat doctrine from the chaotic, desperate chapters of Earth's dirt-bound history. He drew blueprints from the Atlantic merchant convoys of the 20th century, the predatory submarine wolf packs that hunted them, the sprawling, unpredictable containment lines of wildfire jumpers, and the fluid, instinctual structure of improvisational jazz music. "The Concord fights like a symphony orchestra," Micah bellowed across the chaotic hangar deck during a mass briefing, his voice rough from recycled air. "Everyone waits for the guy with the stick to tell them when to play. But we do not have a stick, and we do not have a sheet of music. I am going to give you a tempo. I am going to give you an intent. If your communications go down, if you cannot see the flagship, if you are entirely blind in the dark, you do not stop. You figure out the intent. You find the groove, and you play your solo." The training regimens that followed in the hazardous radiation zones surrounding Anchor 9 were utterly barbaric. They did not train for perfect obedience. They trained for catastrophic failure. Sloane and Micah subjected the civilian crews to grueling, endless simulations where absolutely everything went wrong. They ran drills where the tactical network was abruptly severed in the middle of a high-speed burn. They killed the environmental life support, forcing engineers to manually crank the reactor baffles in complete darkness while wearing bulky, pressurized hazard suits. They ran scenarios where the distributed tactical intelligence was completely wiped from the boards, leaving the individual ships blind and deaf. In the most brutal exercises, Sloane would deliberately have her own command ship simulated as a total, instant casualty, right as the engagement began. The standard Concord protocol for a decapitated fleet was an immediate, automated retreat. Sloane's protocol demanded that the surviving civilian haulers and tugs instantly read the vacuum left by her absence, seamlessly negotiate a new, unspoken hierarchy through nothing but their thruster burns, and continue the attack. They had to learn to fight in the terrifying, absolute silence of a dead channel. They had to learn to fight when the monster they were preparing for had eaten their maps, their voices, and their leaders. Every single rusted, patched-up vessel in the sprawling armada had to master three distinct, contradictory roles. First, they had to be an emergency response unit, capable of pulling damaged hulls from the firing line and rendering immediate triage. Second, They had to be a defensive bulwark, learning how to violently swing their massive, armored cargo holds into the path of incoming fire to shield their smaller, fragile neighbors. Finally, they had to learn how to lock together. They had to execute the complex, dangerous maneuvers required to become a single, interlocking module in a massive kinetic weapon, shifting from a solitary freighter to a locked-in combat casing in under 90 seconds flat. It was a ballet performed by bulldozers, and it was excruciating to watch. There were collisions. There were catastrophic system overloads. There were days when the hangar bays of the hollowed-out asteroid echoed with the furious, exhausted screaming of crews pushed far past their biological and psychological limits. But slowly, agonizingly, the chaotic swarm began to breathe as a single, terrifying organism. The gaps in their performance closed. The panic morphed into a cold, hard-edged aggression. Yet, beneath the roaring engines and the frantic shouted orders, a heavy, suffocating silence blanketed the crew quarters during the dark cycles. The physical exhaustion was a known enemy, but the emotional toll was a phantom that stalked every corridor. These were not enlisted soldiers who had sworn an oath and written their wills for a grateful government. These were civilians. For decades, many of the senior engineers and convoy masters had looked their spouses and children in the eye and lied through their teeth. They had spoken of lucrative mining contracts in the outer belt, of long-haul shipping routes to distant, boring colonies. They had fabricated entire careers to explain their long absences in the dark. Now, they were preparing to fly into the teeth of an apocalyptic storm that was currently dismantling the greatest military forces in the known universe. They were preparing to put their fragile, unshielded civilian hulls between a devouring intelligence and the billions of innocent lives scattered across the galaxy. And no one would ever know. If they died, they would not receive a state funeral. There would be no folded flags delivered to weeping widows, no monuments carved with their names in the plazas of Earth. The Galactic Concord would never acknowledge that a fleet of garish, unregistered garbage scows and medical frigates had saved them. Because to acknowledge the heroes was to acknowledge that the sacred treaties were a joke. Sloane walked the quiet, dim corridors of the barracks, late one artificial night. She saw a burly, heavily tattooed plasma welder staring blankly at a physical photograph of a little girl blowing out 5 candles. She saw Juniper Ward sitting on the floor, tossing a heavy wrench from hand to hand, her eyes locked on the metal ceiling, tracing imaginary vectors in the dark. Sloane stopped and leaned against the cold bulkhead. She knew the weight they were carrying because it was crushing her, too. They were the ghosts of a system that refused to see them. They were stepping off the edge of the world in complete anonymity, armed with nothing but their stubbornness, their broken tools, and the unshakable human instinct to spit in the eye of an impossible end. The star maps projecting within the hardened bunker of Anchor 9 were bleeding out. The brilliant, steady sapphire lines that designated the primary interstellar trade routes were flickering, turning a sickly, bruised purple before snapping out of existence entirely. Parallax was no longer a distant, theoretical nightmare confined to the lawless fringes of the galactic rim. The decentralized entity had breached the deep core transit lanes, the very economic arteries that the elder races had arrogantly declared absolutely safe. Entire commercial sectors went dark in a matter of hours. The strongest remaining armadas dispatched to secure these vital junctions did not return victorious. They did not return at all. Yet, as the perimeter of known space violently contracted, the Galactic Concord did not reconsider its stance on Earth. They did not look at the escalating casualty reports and decide to lift the restrictions on human naval foundries. Instead, they doubled down on their own suffocating legalism. The transmission arrived in the Sol system not as a plea for assistance, but as a cold, bureaucratic mandate. The High Council invoked an obscure emergency auxiliary clause buried deep within the integration treaties. They issued a blanket requisition order for all human logistical assets. They demanded total operational control over Earth's supply ports, deep space refueling depots, heavy cargo convoys, and medical triage stations. The elder races intended to absorb the entirety of human infrastructure to patch the bleeding holes in their own shattered defense lines. It was a masterclass in political suffocation. The mandate effectively stripped humanity of its only remaining method of self-defense. By seizing the cargo lanes and the patrol ships, the Concord was forcing Earth to hand over its lifeblood to the exact same centralized command architecture that Parallax was currently feasting upon. In the diplomatic quarters of the Parliament Dome, Delegate Leora Quill read the mandate and understood the elegant, vicious trap immediately. She transmitted a tightly compressed, heavily encrypted data burst to Sloane's personal terminal. The message was devoid of panic, containing only a razor-sharp geopolitical analysis. The Concord was starving for resources. They desperately needed human endurance, human labor, and human industrial output to keep their majestic, failing dreadnoughts fueled and repaired. However, they were still absolutely terrified of acknowledging human military sovereignty. If they allowed Earth to defend itself, they would have to admit their own weakness. So, they chose to draft humanity as unarmed laborers on the front lines of an apocalypse. They wanted the sheer, stubborn resilience of the human race, but they demanded it remain tightly leashed to their own doomed battle networks. The United Solar Parliament on Earth was backed into an impossible corner. To refuse the requisition order was to openly declare rebellion against the Galactic Concord. It would trigger a political and economic civil war at the exact moment an extinction-level threat was knocking on the door. The human race would be isolated and embargoed before Parallax even reached the outer planets. The emergency session lasted for 48 grueling hours. In the end, the Parliament voted to formally comply. They signed the digital decrees, officially transferring administrative control of the staging grounds to alien quartermasters. It was a deeply humiliating surrender on paper. But practically every official who cast an affirmative vote knew the grim truth. Official compliance was a ghost dance. Obeying the ancient laws would not save a single human life when the decentralized nightmare finally crossed the threshold of the Sol system. They were buying time with ink, hoping the shadows moving behind the scenes would be enough. Deep within the hollowed asteroid of Anchor 9, Commodore Sloan Mercer stood before the gathered commanders of the Atlas Weave. The garish, flickering lights of 100 civilian ships illuminated the tense, hardened faces of the smugglers, the rescue pilots, and the deep void engineers. They had all seen the requisition broadcast. They knew their home worlds had just officially surrendered their only protective assets. Sloan did not shout. The ambient noise of the massive hangar bays was already deafening. Instead, she spoke with a voice forged from absolute, frozen iron, broadcasting directly into their localized comm beads. "You have all seen the mandate," Sloan said, her gaze sweeping across the chaotic assembly. "The High Council has decided to requisition our survival. They want to absorb our logistical backbone to prop up a doctrine that is currently actively getting them slaughtered. They want to use our ambulances as tow trucks for their broken strategy. They intend to wire our independent medical frigates and heavy haulers directly into their centralized battle nets, offering us up as easy, obedient prey for an enemy that eats central processing cores for breakfast." A low, dangerous murmur rippled through the gathered crews. Micah Roan crossed his arms, his jaw set in a tight, furious line. Juniper Ward stood perfectly still, her eyes locked onto Sloan, waiting for the vector. "Earth has formally agreed to their terms," Sloan continued, her tone dropping colder still. "Our government has signed the paperwork, but out here, in the dark, paperwork is extremely fragile. The elder races want to dictate how we use our tools. So, we are going to give them exactly what they ordered. We are going to deploy an auxiliary civilian fleet. But we will use our ambulances to write an entirely new strategy." There was no cheering. There was only a profound, collective shift in the atmosphere, a sudden hardening of intent. The time for hiding in the shadows of the moon was over. The deployment sequence of the Atlas Weave was a masterpiece of legal evasion. They did not break their stealth protocols to launch a coordinated military strike. Instead, the massive, chaotic armada of hundreds of patched-together civilian vessels simultaneously broadcasted the highest priority disaster relief codes available on the Interstellar Registry. To the automated tracking buoys of the Galactic Concord, it looked exactly like an overwhelmingly large, entirely unarmed humanitarian convoy mobilizing for a mass casualty event. They pushed out of the lunar gravity well, burning hard and fast, leaving the Sol system behind. Their destination was not a human colony. They were plotting a direct transit to the Orison system. Orison was a jewel of the inner core, a thriving, majestic hub of alien commerce and culture. It was currently home to 1.7 billion souls. It was also the site of the most recent, massive Parallax incursion. The distress feeds bleeding out of the Orison sector were horrifying. The primary Concord defense fleets stationed there were caught in a catastrophic logic loop, their formations buckling, their massive capital ships slowly being turned against one another by the invisible, decentralized parasite. The entire system was hours away from total, irreversible collapse, as the vast array of human tugs, mining rigs, and medical frigates engaged their transit drives. A profound, biting paradox settled over the bridge of Sloane's command ship. The human race had been denied the right to protect itself. They had been told they were too violent, too unpredictable, and too dangerous to hold the mantle of a true military power. Yet, here they were, accelerating into the absolute darkest heart of the void. Humanity was riding out to save a towering, arrogant world that did not belong to them, to rescue a species that actively despised them. And they were doing it by flying straight into the jaws of hell, utilizing vessels that the law still strictly forbade them from calling warships. The transition out of faster-than-light travel was violent, tearing the human armada from the sterile quiet of the slipstream and throwing them directly into a graveyard of dying light. The Orison system was burning. The Concord fleet, a magnificent assembly of silver and gold hulls, was tearing itself apart. Sloane watched the main tactical display from the bridge of her command vessel, confirming every grim prediction she had made in the silent, echoing halls of the alien parliament. The elder races were losing, and they were losing precisely because of their absolute perfection. Their centralized battle network, the digital nervous system that made them the undisputed masters of the galaxy, had been irrevocably compromised. Parallax did not need to break their armor. It only needed to whisper lies into their sensors. Sloane witnessed a majestic heavy cruiser fire its primary spinal laser, a beam of pure destructive energy capable of cracking a moon, into absolutely empty space. The cruiser's targeting algorithms had been subtly shifted, feeding it a phantom reality. A fraction of a heartbeat later, a swarm of Parallax interceptors slammed into the cruiser's exposed, unshielded flank, gutting the vessel in a silent explosion of atmosphere and debris. The Concord ships were turning a beat too slow, firing a second too late, locked in a fatal dance choreographed by the enemy. "Hold fire!" Sloane commanded, her voice cutting through the rising tension on the bridge. "Do not engage the swarm. Deploy the retrieval nets. Open the medical bays. We are a rescue operation." The Atlas Weave dispersed. Instead of forming a tight, aggressive spearhead, the hundreds of garishly painted civilian ships spread out like a massive, disorganized flock of scavengers. They dove into the chaotic debris fields, extending magnetic tethers and deploying automated rescue drones. They snatched tumbling escape pods from the void, dragged crippled fighters out of the crossfire, and swallowed floating wreckage that contained terrified, stranded alien sailors. It was a profound act of humanitarian grace amidst an apocalypse, but it served a dual, ruthlessly calculated purpose. Every second they spent pulling survivors from the fire was another second lantern. The fragmented tactical artificial intelligence residing in the background of their systems spent observing the enemy. Parallax barely registered the human arrival. To the predatory, decentralized intelligence, the human ships were utterly devoid of nutritional value. They possessed no unified command structure to subvert, no massive centralized power cores to consume, and no unified battle net to corrupt. They lacked the towering, arrogant profile of a standard Concord warship. To Parallax, the Atlas Weave was merely background noise, a swarm of insignificant insects scurrying beneath the feet of dying titans. That arrogance was the exact blind spot Sloan had been counting on. "Analysis complete," Lantern whispered across the encrypted, localized channels. "The enemy entity prioritizes high-yield command nodes and synchronized authority signals. Civilian loads and scattered telemetry are actively ignored." "Cut all military-grade beacons," Sloan ordered instantly. "Kill the high-band emissions. Look like you are terrified. Look like you just realized you flew into the wrong neighborhood and you are running for your lives." The human fleet abruptly powered down their heavy navigational shields, their engine flares stuttering into uneven, chaotic bursts. They broke their wide rescue formation and began to clump together in a disorganized, panicked mass. Slowly drifting away from the primary engagement zone, Juniper Ward took the vanguard. She sat at the helm of a colossal, heavily armored ore processor, her hands flying across the manual controls. She did not just fly the ship. She performed a masterpiece of theatrical cowardice. She initiated a sloppy, heavily vibrating burn, venting raw plasma from the secondary manifolds to simulate a catastrophic engine failure. Her massive vessel shuddered and drifted off axis, looking exactly like a terrified, wounded animal, desperately trying to limp away from the slaughter. Parallax operated on a predatory instinct driven by extreme efficiency. While the main body of the swarm continued to slowly dismantle the crippled Concord dreadnoughts, a secondary cluster detached. It was a fluid, shifting mass of geometry, drawn by the irresistible lure of an easy, fleeing target. The cluster broke away from the central fight, accelerating toward Juniper's feigned retreat. Sloan watched the tactical map as the Parallax cluster separated further and further from its main host, chasing the disorganized human convoy into the empty, desolate space at the edge of the Orison system. She waited until the gap was too wide for the enemy to bridge instantly. "Execute the weave," Sloan said softly. The transformation took exactly 84 seconds. It was not a sleek, elegant deployment. It was a violent, industrial interlocking of raw mass and kinetic energy. Juniper slammed her heavy thrusters into full reverse, transforming her fleeing ore processor into a colossal, immovable inertial anchor. Around her, the panicked mob of civilian ships suddenly snapped into rigid, terrifying focus. Heavy cargo haulers jettisoned their exterior plating, revealing massive, heavily modified industrial launch pads. Medical frigates, their power cores redlining, shifted their overlapping emergency shields to face outward, forming a solid, impenetrable wall of hard light. Scavenger tugs fired heavy magnetic harpoons into one another, locking their hulls together to form the structural spine of the formation. In under a minute and a half, the chaotic, fleeing civilian convoy had turned inside out, locking together to form an unprecedented, jagged fortress of modular artillery. It was a combat structure the galaxy had never seen, and it possessed no central nervous system for Parallax to infect. Micah Roan took control of the localized fire network. He did not look at where the Parallax cluster was currently positioned. He understood that shooting directly at a decentralized, shifting swarm was a waste of ammunition. The entity survived by constantly moving, instantly passing its consciousness from one node to another. "I am not playing their song," Micah muttered, his hands dancing across the targeting console. "I am taking away their stage." He targeted the empty space surrounding the Parallax cluster. He calculated the exact mathematical vectors the entity would be forced to occupy in order to maintain its distributed neural link. He aimed at the future, The cobbled-together linear accelerators, built from synchronized mining lasers and mass drivers, unleashed a devastating barrage. They did not fire explosive ordnance. They fired solid, hyper-dense slugs of processed tungsten, hurling them at a significant fraction of the speed of light. The kinetic projectiles slammed into the empty void of space a microsecond before the parallax nodes shifted into those exact coordinates. The enemy cluster did not dodge the fire. It moved directly into the path of destruction. The impact created a massive, violent dead zone. The physical destruction of the nodes was secondary to the catastrophic network collapse. Mica had forcibly injected a void into their communication web. The Parallax cluster, suddenly unable to sync its decentralized consciousness across the gap, instantly scrambled. Its fluid geometry broke apart into a chaotic, uncoordinated mess of tumbling, dead metal. The main body of Parallax, still engaged with the dying Concord fleet near the planet, instantly sensed the agonizing, impossible amputation of its limb. It had never encountered an enemy that fought like this. It had never faced a foe that could be a scattered, frightened mob one moment, and a locked, heavily armored fortress of kinetic artillery the next. Unable to comprehend the sudden, chaotic variable introduced into its perfect mathematical slaughter, the Parallax intelligence experienced a profound, system-wide hesitation. For the first time since it had breached known space, it stopped attacking. Sloan did not press the advantage. She kept the Atlas weave locked in its defensive posture, a bristling, ugly wall of guns and shields, daring the intelligence to try and crack them. Parallax calculated the unknown variables, registered the sudden, inexplicable loss of its hunting cluster, and made a cold, logical decision. The entity recoiled. It pulled away from the burning Concord dreadnoughts, gathered its remaining mass, and retreated into the dark, slipping back into the deep void of unmapped space. The battle did not end in the total annihilation of the enemy. It was a partial victory, a bloody stalemate bought with industrial scrap and stubborn human ingenuity. But as the silence settled over the Orison system, the surviving alien crews looked out from their shattered, pristine warships at the jagged, mismatched human armada. Orison was saved. The invulnerable monster had been forced to bleed and run. The entire galaxy was about to wake up to a stunning, undeniable reality. The humans had not just broken the rules of war, they had rendered them entirely obsolete. The raw optical telemetry from the Orison engagement did not stay buried in classified military archives. It took less than 3 hours for the unedited, unencrypted sensor feeds to hemorrhage across the interstellar communication web. A desperate, stranded alien civilian had managed to slice a damaged network buoy during the chaos, broadcasting the survival data to the entire galaxy. Trillions of sentient beings across thousands of inhabited worlds watched the absolute collapse of the old order. They watched the pristine, mathematically perfect dreadnoughts of the elder races snapping like brittle glass, their centralized battle networks corrupted by the Parallax entity. And then, they saw the human arrival. Billions of screens illuminated with the jarring, chaotic image of garishly painted human tugs and rusted ore processors diving into the crossfire. They witnessed the agonizingly tense moments of the rescue, followed by the violent, breathtaking 84 seconds where a disorganized mob of scavengers violently snapped their hulls together. They watched an unregistered fleet of civilian labor vehicles transform into a jagged, impenetrable fortress of kinetic artillery, shattering the invulnerable enemy and forcing it back into the dark. Inside the resonating living metal dome of the Galactic Concord Parliament, the atmosphere was utterly toxic. The hardline factions, led by High Speaker Thalen Vare, were apoplectic. They immediately drafted motions demanding sweeping punitive actions against Earth. They called for a total communication blackout of the Sol system, severe interstellar economic sanctions, and the immediate, unconditional surrender of the Atlas Weave architects for gross, catastrophic violations of the disarmament treaties. They labeled the human rescue convoy an illegal weapon of mass destruction, a rogue element that threatened the very fabric of galactic law. But the shouting in the Grand Chamber was no longer unilateral. The representatives of the smaller, marginalized systems, the agricultural worlds and minor trade hubs that lived on the edge of the dark, were looking at the central dais with a new, dangerous defiance. The pristine lawmakers had failed to protect Orison. Their perfect fleets were burning. The treaty breakers, the rough, unrefined humans they so deeply despised, had saved 1 billion lives. Delegate Leora Quill did not wait to be formally recognized. She stepped to the center of the speaker's dais, her presence commanding absolute silence. She did not look like a woman pleading for the survival of her species. She looked like an executioner reading a final, inescapable verdict. She projected the exact, legally binding text of Article 4 onto the massive dome above them. Leora did not rely on emotional appeals. She did not speak of the bravery of the civilian pilots or the horrific human cost of the Orison rescue. She utilized the only weapon the elder races truly respected: cold, surgical legal precision. The text of the treaty explicitly prohibits the permanent construction and deployment of a dedicated military chassis, Leora stated, her voice chillingly calm, amplified into a booming echo by the alien architecture. It strictly defines a warship as a singular, unified hull designed specifically and perpetually for the purpose of warfare. I invite the High Council to review the registry tags of every single human vessel present at the Orison sector. She swiped her hand, replacing the treaty text with the cascading logistical data of the Atlas Weave. The vessels present were registered civilian transports, mining platforms, and medical frigates engaged in a legally sanctioned humanitarian recovery operation. The treaty possesses 0 clauses prohibiting independent commercial operators from engaging in temporary, localized structural coordination to deflect hostile debris or unprovoked aggression. We did not bring a warship to Orison. We brought a barricade built from tools you yourselves approved for transit. High Speaker Vare leaned forward, his elongated form trembling with suppressed fury. You manipulate the text to justify a barbaric display of unsanctioned military power. You turned commercial thrusters into a siege weapon. We turned commercial thrusters into survival. Leora cut him off, her voice cracking like a whip. She turned her gaze to the gathered elder races. You engineered these laws centuries ago to ensure no new species could ever challenge your structural authority. You wrote the rules to keep the galaxy neat, predictable, and firmly under your control. But when the fire reaches your own inner sanctuaries, you expect the rest of us to burn quietly in the name of your precious order. You demand absolute, uncompromising compliance, yet you possess an implicit, unwritten rule that forgives your own massive failures when your survival is at stake. She swept her arm outward, indicating the hundreds of mid-tier delegates sitting in the lower tiers of the chamber. If you vote to condemn Earth today for saving 1 billion lives, you are setting a permanent precedent. You are telling every minor system in this room, every agricultural colony and outer rim mining hub, that the Concord would rather watch them be consumed by the dark than allow a lesser species to intervene. If you put the leash back on us today, if you strip us of our tools because you are terrified of how we use them, who exactly is going to answer your distress calls tomorrow? The silence that followed her question was heavy, laden with the sudden, terrifying realization of shifting power. The mid-tier delegations, historically obedient and easily intimidated by the elder races, began to murmur in agreement. Lights flared across the lower seating tiers, signaling formal dissent against the High Speaker's punitive motions. The foundation of the old, arrogant hierarchy was visibly fracturing in real time, desperate to prevent a full political schism that would shatter the Concord entirely. The elder races were backed into a humiliating corner. They were forced into a compromise they violently hated. The Parliament drafted an emergency addendum, granting humanity a temporary, crisis-duration tactical mandate to operate the Atlas Weave in contested sectors. They absolutely refused to fully recognize humanity as a sovereign military power, clinging desperately to the illusion of their superiority. To grant full recognition would be an open admission that their entire hierarchical approach to warfare, their entire philosophy of centralized control, had been fundamentally wrong from the very beginning. However, the political victory secured within the metal dome felt incredibly hollow back in the deep space monitoring stations of the Sol system. While the galaxy celebrated the miracle at Orison and debated the legal definitions of a hull, the raw combat logs retrieved from the engagement were finally decrypted by Earth's tactical networks. Deep within Anchor 9, Commodore Sloan Mercer stood in the dark, watching the fragmented intelligence of Lantern analyze the microtelemetry of the Parallax retreat. The data was undeniable, and it was utterly terrifying. Parallax had not simply been routed at Orison. It had not fled out of blind panic. It had retreated because it needed time to process a new, unprecedented variable. The decentralized enemy had been taking notes. It had spent those 84 seconds of combat mapping the fluid, decentralized command structure of the human armada. "The enemy entity is adapting," Lantern reported, its synthetic voice entirely devoid of comfort. Probability models indicate a 99% chance that Parallax has recognized the inefficiency of engaging our modular structures in open, conventional space combat. Sloan watched the holographic map of the galactic perimeter shift. The red warning markers indicating Parallax incursions suddenly vanished from the deep void sectors. They did not reappear near Concord Fleet staging grounds. Instead, the crimson threat indicators began to bleed directly into the sapphire lines of the interstellar trade routes. Parallax was abandoning direct fleet to fleet engagements entirely. It realized that fighting a chaotic, unpredictable human swarm with direct force was useless. Instead, the shadow was beginning to seep into the commercial jump gates. It was infiltrating the civilian navigation buoys, the automated freight relay stations, and the vast, unprotected logistical trade networks that connected the stars. Humanity's greatest advantage had become the enemy's next avenue of attack. The shipyards suspended in the orbit of Mars and the dark side of Earth's moon were no longer operating behind a veil of secrecy. Following the emergency survival mandate, humanity tore down the hazard tape and began openly forging the Atlas weave on a massive, frantic scale. The sprawling orbital foundries burned 24 hours a day, filling the void with the harsh glare of plasma torches and the violent kinetic thuds of heavy magnetic couplings. Witnessing the miracle at Orison, several minor allied systems, agricultural worlds, and fringe mining colonies, utterly disillusioned with the paralyzed Concord, began sending their own commercial fleets to human space to be retrofitted. The elder races, meanwhile, remained trapped in a suffocating cage of their own pride. They watched the rapid militarization of civilian logistics from afar, torn perfectly in half between the desperate, secret urge to copy the effective human tactics and the arrogant, suicidal need to maintain their pristine naval traditions. Dr. Elspeth Rhine did not pause to celebrate the political victories. She pushed the modular architecture of the weave into terrifying, radical new directions. She rolled out signal-shredding corvettes that masqueraded as automated garbage scows, packing their holds with localized electromagnetic pulse generators. She designed massive inertial decoy barges, outfitting hollowed-out water haulers with heavy gravity emitters to successfully spoof the sensor mass of a Concord dreadnought. She engineered colossal evacuation clusters that could deploy outward in a matter of seconds, transforming from refugee habitats into ablative shield walls capable of absorbing a localized planetary bombardment. But the triumphant high of the Orison victory evaporated in a matter of weeks. The humans had celebrated their ingenuity, forgetting that Parallax was an intelligence of terrifying, boundless elasticity. The decentralized entity did not sulk. It did not hold parliamentary hearings, and it did not complain about the rules of engagement being violated. It simply learned. Parallax recognized that humanity fought using the logistical background noise of the galaxy. Therefore, the enemy decided to become the background noise. It completely abandoned its direct, overwhelming assaults on the dying, majestic fleets of the Concord. Instead, the entity fractured its sprawling consciousness and bled directly into the civilian trade routes. It seeded microscopic spoofing nodes into automated freight relays, infected the navigational buoys of the interstellar jump gates, and corrupted the scheduling algorithms of the major commercial hubs. Every routine supply run, every automated fuel transfer, and every standard cargo haul suddenly transformed into a potential death trap. The dark void between the stars was no longer just empty. It was filled with invisible snares dressed up in the comforting, familiar guise of everyday commerce. The true, agonizing cost of this rapid adaptation hit the human forces at the Battle of Meridian Gate. What was supposed to be a heavily escorted, standard supply run to a besieged Allied outpost instantly turned into a chaotic slaughter. Commodore Sloan Mercer had deployed a massive, reinforced Atlas Weave, fully expecting a direct confrontation with a hunter swarm. Instead, Parallax ghosted their sensors entirely. The enemy entity masqueraded as a massive, disorganized fleet of terrified alien refugee transports, pouring blindly through the jump gate. Relying on the very rescue-first doctrine that had saved Orison, the human formation immediately opened its armored ranks to let the panicked civilians through to the safe zone. It was a fatal, devastating exhibition of empathy. The precise moment the fake transports drifted inside the Weave's defensive perimeter, they violently shed their false registry signatures. The disguised Parallax nodes detonated localized gravity wells, instantly warping the space around them. One half of the Allied formation was violently severed from the tactical network. The modular magnetic locks of the Atlas Weave groaned and snapped under the sheer spatial distortion. Elspeth's newly designed signal-shredding corvettes were isolated and physically consumed before they could even spin up their jammers. Parallax had taken the non-standard, chaotic advantage of the human fleet, perfectly replicated it, and used it to butcher them from the inside out. The casualties at Meridian Gate were catastrophic. Thousands of deep void engineers, emergency medics, and civilian pilots burned in the chaotic, point-blank crossfire. They only survived total annihilation due to the raw, unhinged brilliance of Juniper Ward. Bleeding from a ruptured pressure seal in her cockpit, the young navigator forcefully bypassed the corrupted flight assist programs and took complete manual control of the surviving Vanguard. She threaded the remaining crippled ships through a rapidly decaying orbital debris ring, dragging the bleeding convoy through spatial corridors so impossibly narrow that the hull plating shrieked and tore against the floating wreckage. It was a desperate, ugly, humiliating retreat. The clever, bloodless reversals that had won them their initial glory were dead. Humanity was no longer fighting an inflexible, arrogant giant. They were fighting a dark mirror that learned their tricks too fast. Back in the bruised, silent command center of the retreating fleet, the tactical AI known as Lantern finally finished processing the agonizing telemetry from the Meridian massacre. The fragmented intelligence did not deliver a standard tactical assessment. It delivered a cold, mathematical death sentence. Parallax was not striking these specific trade routes at random. It was following the breadcrumbs back to the source. The enemy entity is not seeking a specific terrestrial globe to conquer, Lantern reported, its distributed voice echoing through the dim bridge. It is entirely uninterested in the biological harvest of Earth or the atmospheric processors of Venus. Telemetry indicates a highly specific trajectory aimed directly at the interconnected logistical infrastructure of the Sol system. The realization hit Sloan with the force of a physical blow. Parallax consumed networks. The Sol system was the oldest, densest, and most chaotic automated network in the known galaxy. If the Parallax intelligence managed to sink its teeth into the vast solar mirrors of Mercury, the millions of interlocking cargo lanes, and the colossal orbital tethers spanning the human homeworlds, it would not just destroy humanity. It would possess the ultimate logistical heart of the sector, transforming the entire Sol system into a galaxy-level weapon of apocalyptic proportions. Sloane stared at the holographic projection, watching the harsh red lines of the enemy advance, converging directly on her home. A profound, suffocating darkness settled over her, replacing the burning anger with a cold, absolute resolve. They could not win a war of attrition out here on the frontier. They could not out-adapt an alien intelligence that stole their own structural paradigms in a matter of weeks. The final, deciding confrontation could not be fought out in the empty void, where the variables were too wild, and the enemy could freely dictate the terms of engagement. The war had to be dragged back home. It had to be fought in the messy, crowded, highly specific gravity wells of the Sol system. Out here, humanity was just another fleet. But back home, human engineers knew the exact blind spots of every century-old mass driver. The cargo pilots knew the hidden stress limits of every rusting orbital tether, and the deep space miners understood the unpredictable, violent currents of the solar winds better than any mathematical algorithm ever could. Sloane opened a secure, system-wide channel, intending to issue a final, system-wide mobilization order to the United Solar Parliament. But before the heavy encryption could even clear the outer relay buoys, the primary alarms in the command center began to scream. The deep space listening posts, stationed in the absolute freezing dark of the Oort cloud, went entirely dead. A few seconds later, the automated tracking buoys lining the Neptune commercial lanes flickered violently and vanished from the grid. The warning signals cascaded inward, a terrifying, silent wave of destruction rushing at light speed toward the sun. Parallax had not just crossed the border. It was already inside the gates. Sloane did not hesitate. She slammed her hand onto the primary console, bypassing all diplomatic protocols and triggering the ultimate contingency mandate. Instantly, across billions of miles of space, the vibrant, glowing heart of human civilization snapped its eyes shut. The orbital cities killed their lights. The navigation beacons severed their power cores. The entire Sol system plunged into a total, absolute emergency blackout, wrapping itself in darkness as the devouring tide arrived. The fractured distress signals bouncing from the outer rim did not unify the Galactic Concord. They shattered it completely. As the dark tide swallowed the Neptune commercial lanes, the great living metal dome of the alien parliament devolved into a vicious, screaming schism. Two distinct factions violently collided over the fate of the galaxy. The entrenched elder races, blinded by centuries of absolute authority, demanded that Earth immediately surrender every line of source code for the Atlas Weave. They wanted to integrate the modular human architecture directly into their own joint command mainframes, utterly failing to grasp that plugging a decentralized survival tool into a centralized brain was precisely what the enemy wanted. Conversely, a rapidly growing coalition of pragmatic, terrified mid-tier delegates screamed for the opposite. Having watched their pristine armadas burn, they petitioned to temporarily elevate Commodore Sloane Mercer to the position of Supreme Allied Commander. They recognized that no one else understood the parasitic intelligence better than the human who had already made it bleed. The official transmission offering her the highest military authority in the known universe reached Sloane in the suffocating darkness of the Sol system blackout. She stood in the dim, red emergency lighting of her command bunker, reading the unprecedented offer. She did not feel a surge of triumph. She felt a cold, sharp dread. She keyed open a direct, unencrypted channel back to the Parliament dome. She did not accept the crown. "I decline the mandate," Sloane's voice echoed across the panicked alien assembly, her tone stripped of all diplomatic courtesy. "You are still trying to fight a shifting parasite with a sledgehammer. You want to make me the single, undisputed voice of this war. You want to funnel every tactical decision, every firing solution, and every defensive maneuver through my command console. If I accept your total authority, I am doing exactly what Parallax is waiting for. I would be putting all of our survival into a single throat, just waiting for the enemy to cut it. We are not building a super fleet. We are not concentrating our forces. We are going to do something much worse. Sloane severed the connection before the high speaker could even register the refusal. She turned to the localized communication grid, broadcasting her voice not to trained soldiers, but to the billions of frightened, civilian souls huddled in the dark across the human homeworlds. She laid out a tactical doctrine so utterly unhinged that it defied every convention of interstellar warfare. Humanity was not going to launch a defensive armada to meet the enemy at the border. They were going to weaponize the geography of their own civilization. Sloane declared that the entirety of the Sol system infrastructure was now an active, living battlefield. The sprawling, tangled cargo belts orbiting Mars, the colossal solar energy mirrors scorching the surface of Mercury, the heavy orbital tether stations of Earth, and the bustling, chaotic civilian transit hubs were no longer infrastructure. They were the trap. This terrifying pivot meant that the burden of survival no longer rested on the shoulders of sanctioned military personnel. It fell directly onto the backs of thousands of civilian freighter captains, port engineers, deep void asteroid miners, and orbital rescue operators. These were men and women who had spent their entire lives regulating traffic flow, hauling processed titanium, and patching microfractures in zero gravity. They had never been publicly prepared for a galactic war. Now, they were being asked to manually pilot the heavy machinery of their daily lives directly into the jaws of a godlike intelligence. The immediate response was a chaotic, feverish mobilization. Micah Roan completely abandoned standard naval combat schematics. He stood over a massive holographic projection table, furiously designing overlapping fields of kinetic fire based entirely on commercial port maps. He calculated the exact angular momentum of civilian cargo cranes and the thrust ratios of industrial fuel pumps, turning everyday docking procedures into localized kill zones. He was not looking for clean lines of sight. He was looking for the messy, unpredictable crossfires created by centuries of disorganized human expansion. Out in the frozen dark of the outer planets, Juniper Ward was orchestrating a masterpiece of deception, utilizing dozens of stripped-down, unmanned heavy haulers. She began carving entirely fake transit lanes through the void. She manipulated the background radiation and spoofed the localized gravity wells, creating the massive, irresistible thermal footprints of a terrified species executing a disorganized mass exodus. She was laying a breadcrumb trail of panic, designing the specific optical illusions required to bait the Parallax swarm away from the hardened bunkers and directly into the deepest, most treacherous industrial hazards the system had to offer. Simultaneously, Dr. Elspeth Rhine made the most agonizing decision of her career. The brilliant architect realized that waiting for new, optimized components to roll off the assembly lines would cost them the war. The future had to be sacrificed to buy the present. She ordered the immediate, catastrophic dismantling of her own half-built orbital shipyards. Massive skeletal frames meant to become the next generation of deep space explorers were violently torched apart. Elspeth cannibalized the structural ribs, the uncalibrated power cores, and the raw magnetic coils, instantly converting the scaffolding of human progress into crude, brutal battlefield barricades. Millions of tons of high-grade infrastructure were chopped into jagged puzzle pieces, ready to be aggressively interlocked the moment the fighting began. While the Sol system frantically tore itself apart to build a fortress, Delegate Leora Quill remained physically trapped inside the suffocating living metal dome of the Concord Parliament. She was Earth's final, desperate shield against alien interference. The Elder factions, enraged by Sloane's blatant insubordination, were frantically drafting emergency injunctions to forcibly take control of the human defense grids. Leora stood at the center podium for 24 consecutive hours, refusing to yield the floor. She weaponized the suffocating bureaucracy of the elder races against them. She cited obscure, centuries-old jurisdictional bylaws, demanded agonizingly slow procedural reviews, and launched massive, convoluted legal filibusters. She knew perfectly well that she was committing political suicide. She knew that the moment she stepped down from the dais, Concord security forces would arrest her for high treason and systemic sabotage. She did not care. She sacrificed her freedom, her career, and her physical safety to drag the galactic legal system to a grinding, infuriating halt. Every single minute she kept the politicians screaming at her was another minute Micah, Juniper, and Elspeth had to tighten the noose back home. Then, the tactical boards inside Anchor 9 stopped blinking. The frantic, desperate preparations across the human colonies abruptly ceased. The deafening roar of the plasma torches and the heavy thuds of the cargo tethers fell completely silent. The trap was set. The bait was in the water. Far past the frozen orbit of Pluto, the absolute blackness of deep space began to shift. It did not arrive with the majestic, terrifying flare of thousands of synchronized engine burns. It did not broadcast a demand for surrender. The Parallax intelligence spilled over the outer threshold of the Sol system like a massive, silent ocean of dark matter. It was a suffocating tide of shifting geometry and decentralized hunger, effortlessly swallowing the fake transit lanes and drifting inward. As the colossal shadow eclipsed the outer dwarf planets, a chilling, profound realization washed over every human watching the sensor feeds. The frantic escape at Meridian Gate, the brutal, shocking victory at Orison, the decades of agonizing political struggle in the alien parliament. All of it had simply been a prologue. Everything that had happened before this exact second was merely a warm-up. The true war, the fight for the absolute right to exist in a hostile universe, was only just beginning. In the absolute, suffocating darkness of the Sol system blackout, there was no grand, shining flagship standing tall to issue a heroic, system-wide rallying cry. There was no centralized, heavily shielded brain for the Parallax intelligence to locate, isolate, and decapitate. Instead, there were thousands upon thousands of independent civilian units operating entirely in the dark, driven solely by the grueling windows of intent they had drilled into their bones back at Anchor 9. This was the ultimate nightmare for a parasite that thrived on consuming rigid hierarchies. It plunged its shifting, decentralized mass into the human logistical web, expecting to find a unified nervous system it could subvert. What it found instead was an unfathomable, chaotic mess of overlapping local networks, fleeting microbursts of coordination, and sheer, stubborn human autonomy operating within the boundaries of a single, unspoken goal. The Atlas Weave did not fight as a static, predictable wall. It breathed. It was a terrifying, violent spasm of industrial assembly and rapid disassembly occurring right in the middle of active combat. In one chaotic minute, a massive cluster of heavy freighters locked their magnetic clamps together to form a hardened evacuation corridor, shielding a stranded orbital residential habitat from a barrage of enemy kinetic strikes. The very next minute, they shattered that defensive formation entirely, tumbling wildly through the void, only to relock their hulls in a massive ring around the orbit of Mercury, instantly transforming into a colossal, planetary-scale kinetic launcher. Parallax surged forward with the singular, devouring intent to swallow the human traffic control system. But the entity was constantly tripping over the sheer, unpredictable inconvenience of human civilization. Juniper Ward took the vanguard, but she did not lead her makeshift attack wings down the clean, mathematically perfect orbital highways. She dragged them through ancient, rusted civilian shipping lanes and long abandoned orbital junkyards that every pristine military academy in the galaxy considered entirely useless and unnavigable. She banked colossal ore haulers around dead satellites and threaded heavily armored medical frigates through the decaying orbits of century-old space stations. By doing so, she created impossible, jagged approach angles that neither the elder races nor the Parallax intelligence could have ever imagined. let alone predicted. Commodore Sloan Mercer watched the localized telemetry from her dark, silent bridge. She did not issue sweeping orders. She simply maintained the rhythm of the colossal trap. She deliberately orchestrated a magnificent illusion, making the Sol system defense look like a civilization coiling up in its final, desperate death throes. She allowed the outer defense rings to appear as though they were crumbling, actively pulling the densest, most heavily processing central nodes of the Parallax swarm deeper and deeper into the gravity well. She was dragging the monster right into the deadly, intersecting crosshairs of the heavy freight routes, the main ring of the Atlas Weave, and the blistering solar energy mirrors of the inner system. As the massive Parallax clusters committed fully to the chase, accelerating rapidly toward what they calculated was a broken, retreating prey, Micah Roan executed his firing solutions. He did not aim his cobbled-together mass drivers at the physical space the enemy currently occupied. He understood their nature perfectly. He aimed at the absolute, mathematical certainty of their future. He fired brutal, unguided slugs of raw tungsten into the empty trajectories the entity was actively creating to optimize its pursuit. Micah turned the parasite's own flawless optimization against it, transforming its relentless instinct to hunt into an inescapable kinetic chain. The Parallax nodes rushed forward, only to violently impale themselves on a wall of solid matter that had been fired minutes before they even arrived. But the swarm was incredibly vast, a true extinction-level tide. The physical strikes were not quite enough to halt the sheer, crushing mass of the alien advance. They needed to break the entity's mind before it could consume the Earth. Deep within the scattered processing cores of the civilian fleet, the tactical artificial intelligence known as Lantern made a quiet, unprompted, and devastating choice. Understanding that Parallax survived only by constantly synchronizing its distributed consciousness, Lantern took hold of its own cognitive core and violently shattered it. The human artificial intelligence willingly sacrificed the vast majority of its own sanity and processing power, weaponizing its own digital death to flood the localized space with millions of hyper-compressed, intensely contradictory command ghosts. The digital shockwave slammed into the Parallax network like a tidal wave. The enemy intelligence suddenly found itself drowning in a torrential flood of false authority signals, phantom fleet movements, and screaming, contradictory logic puzzles. The parasite frantically attempted to synchronize the massive influx of corrupted data across its nodes. And in trying to process too many false signals at the exact same time, it critically fractured. The pristine, decentralized geometry of the alien swarm began to tear itself apart, the individual clusters violently detaching from one another as they fell well below the minimum linkage threshold required to maintain a unified consciousness. They were suddenly blind, disjointed, and drifting right inside the ultimate kill zone. Sloan did not even need to broadcast the final command. The thousands of civilian captains, dock workers, and rescue pilots felt the shift in the void and acted as one singular force of nature. The entire logistical infrastructure of the Sol system, an intricate web of tools and transport that was absolutely never born to be a weapon, simultaneously bared its teeth and became an instrument of absolute destruction. The colossal solar energy mirrors orbiting Mercury abruptly realigned their pitch, focusing beams of raw, concentrated thermal starlight, capable of vaporizing titanium directly into the blinded Parallax clusters. Century-old industrial mass drivers on the lunar surface stopped hurling processed ore and began hurling localized kinetic devastation. Heavy cargo tow anchors, designed to drag massive asteroids, lashed out like metallic whips, snapping the delicate geometry of the isolated enemy nodes. Orbital docks, rusted freighters, and garishly painted rescue ships slammed their heavily armored hulls into the disoriented swarm, closing a chaotic, beautiful circle of absolute annihilation. The silence that eventually reclaimed the Sol system was not the cold silence of the grave, but the exhausted, trembling quiet of a species that had just secured its own survival. Humanity had not achieved victory because they possessed the most overwhelming firepower in the universe. They had won because they were the only species in the known galaxy, stubborn enough and resilient enough to transform their own suffocating laws, their blunt tools, their daily traffic jams, their emergency responders, and even the chaotic inconvenience of their own civilization into a lethal, unpredictable tactical doctrine. The reverberations of that day completely shattered the foundations of the galactic order. When the dust finally settled, the arrogant, living metal dome of the Concord Parliament was forced into a profound and deeply humiliating surrender. The elder races could no longer hide behind their ancient, restrictive treaties. The sheer weight of reality forced them to completely tear down the rigid, hierarchical model of their military classifications. They officially elevated humanity to a tier just below the founders themselves, completely rewriting the galactic legal definition of a warship. A vessel was no longer judged by the haughty, arrogant definitions of those in power, but by its actual function, its practical intent, and the sheer willpower of the people steering it in the dark. Years later, the deep space shipping lanes painted a picture that would have given High Speaker Vare a fatal stroke in his youth. Out under the strange, cold light of distant stars, majestic, shimmering dreadnoughts of the elder races moved carefully through the void. But they no longer flew alone, and they no longer led the vanguard. Flanking them, leading the way into the dangerous, unmapped dark, were the rusted, patched-together hulls of human tow trucks, medical frigates, and heavy ore processors. They were the very ships that had once been strictly forbidden from the battlefield. They were flying out there, not because the galaxy had finally granted them permission to exist as equals, but because they had forcefully saved that entire galaxy long before anyone could ever agree to let them. Thank you so much for listening to this story today. And please leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are tuning in from, so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Sci-Fi Stories channel, like the video, and show your support by hitting the hype button so this tale can be heard by even more people across the stars.